looks at tennis greats Arthur Ashe's road to success and the time he spent in St. Louis. That's next on City Corner. Hi, I'm Steve Potter, and welcome to City Corner. This new book tells the story of Arthur Ashe, who actually lived and honed his craft in St. Louis for a while. We'd like to welcome the author, Crystal Hubbard, and illustrator, Kevin Belford. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Game, Set, Match, Champion Arthur Ashe. Crystal is the name of the book. And how great a tennis player was Arthur Ashe?
Well, he was the world's best, at least in 1975. I think for his era, he probably could have been, let's say, the Roger Federer of his day if he'd spent more time on the courts and less time on his humanitarian efforts. But I don't think he could have stopped helping mankind any more than he could have stopped breathing. Tennis and using tennis as his avenue towards making the world a better place, not just for himself and his children, but for everyone, was of paramount importance to him. And tennis, I think, was just his vehicle to make his voice and actions known.
Kevin, you're an artist. You illustrated this book. What's interesting about this book is there are no photographs. It's all your work. So how did you get involved in this project? And are you a tennis fanatic, or?
Yeah, well, actually I am, but I don't think they knew that. The editor didn't know that. I think it was, Lee and Lowe, the publisher, got hold of me, and we actually never met.
And you both live in the St. Louis area, which is interesting.
Today is the first time we've ever
No, you're
met.
joking.
Nope. I tell better jokes than that.
You're a lot funnier than that. Crystal, you actually met, evidently, Arthur Ashe at some point in your life when you were young?
Yes, I grew up here in St. Louis, and my oldest sister, Kim, at the time, she was 12, and she was a freshman at Villa de Chêne out in St. Louis County, and she was taking tennis, and the combination of liking tennis and being a 12-year-old girl, she became completely enamored with Arthur Ashe. I mean, all of a sudden, Arthur Ashe pictures started appearing all over our house, and she was reading tennis magazines. And one Saturday, she decided to ask my mother to drive her to an exhibition match that Arthur Ashe was playing against Jimmy Connors. And I guess my mother, seeing an opportunity for a nice Saturday alone time, she said, well, you can go, but you have to take your sisters with you. So my mother loaded us into the station wagon, Caprice Estate Classic, and drove us down to the 138th Armory on Market Street, I believe. And
he played there a lot, didn't he? Didn't he practice
we
there?
saw him twice there, but he used to practice there because the floors were wood and slick as I don't know what. We used to take our socks off before the matches, and the kids were allowed to just slip and slide all over the place. That's how slippery it was, so I don't even know how they managed to play. But Kim was responsible for me, my sister Kelly, my sister Joelle, and my sister Lauren, all while she's following her idol. And that's when we got the chance to meet him. He would sign photographs after the matches.
What do you remember about meeting him?
I remember that he didn't look like an athlete. I mean, I was used to seeing these big, brawny types with thick necks. You call their names, they say, huh? And he was just so quiet and serene and calm. He just reminded me more of one of the teachers at my school. I mean, he was wearing the tennis whites. He had the record. I'd seen him play. But that poise that he showed on court translated to his movement and just meeting this little kid who really couldn't care less about tennis at the time. It's just my sister was too shy, let's say, to ask for the autograph herself. And, you know, of course, I had to rat her out as soon as he asked me who the photo was to be made out to. And I said, to Kim. And then I just thought, well, why should she be the only one? I said, could I also have it written out to Kelly and Crystal? And he asked me, who are all these people? And I said, they're my sisters. And he said, oh, where are they? And of course, I pointed right to where my sister Kim was hiding behind this column where there was a big water fountain. Ooh, I paid for that one. But Kim could have been a prize fighter. But it was still worth it.
Before we go any further, let's take a look at one of the images, Kevin's images from the book. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about how you work, Kevin. This is from the book, Game, Set, Match, Champion Arthur Ashe. Tell me about it.
Well, that's one of the early pieces. That was indicative of Arthur's. He was a showboat at the beginning, you know, kind of a egotist. Is that a good? Yeah, let me.
Egotist. I never saw any of the photos for the illustrations for the book, until I got my author's copies in the mail. So I totally went on the faith of our editor, Jennifer Fox at Lee and Low. Even though we're both in St. Louis, I do words and he does art, and Jennifer just has an uncanny knack for putting the perfect illustrator and writer together. So I had no idea how he would translate what I wrote to the image, and I just love this because this is probably one of the only recorded images you will ever see of any time Arthur Ashe can be represented as being somewhat of a grandstander. Mm-hmm. Ron Charity, the figure standing off to the left of him, got on his case about this because he said, you know, there's no, a champion doesn't gloat.
He's playing to the audience, right?
Exactly. And Mr. Charity was his first tennis coach. Ron Charity was one of the best college players at the time when Arthur was between 7 and 10. And I think this represents Arthur's first big win. He was 8, and he'd just beaten a kid who was 11.
Yeah, he started at about that age, didn't he?
Yes, he started carrying around a racket that he just found. His father was the groundskeeper at a public park for African Americans. Yes. Yeah. And since Richmond was segregated at the time, there were parks for black people and parks for white people, and Arthur would play at Brooks Field. And he just, you know, in the course of helping his father maintain the grounds, he found a tennis racket. And Ron Charity, he would go and watch Ron Charity practice on the courts at Brookfield. And Mr. Charity went up to him and said, you know what, that racket is the same size you are. Do you know what to do with it? And that's how their relationship got started.
There's an interesting story how he ended up in St. Louis. We'll get to that in a minute. But Kevin, how did you work? What medium do you use, and were you working off photographs, and how did you approach this project?
Working off photographs. You want, in this case, it's nonfiction, so you want to keep a lot of realism in there. So yeah, I looked up pictures of Ron Charity and everybody in there. You know, I wanted the accurate depiction. I work in acrylic paint on an easel. It's the old way. You know,
it's the old-fashioned way.
Yeah, I eventually get to the computer because nothing happens without a computer. But these are all, you know, actual paintings.
I don't know what you knew about Arthur Ashe before you tackled this project, but I would think once you get into something like this, you end up educating yourself.
Yeah.
So, is it important for you to, once you start working on this project, to find out more about him, not just to, you know, not just to put down your representation of a photograph or your interpretation of a photograph, but for you to sort of understand who the man was? Does that play into what you do?
Absolutely. You just paint for a little while. The research before you paint is more important in many cases, and this is one of those cases. If I had known you were in St. Louis, I probably would have called you, because I went probably right behind you to find sources and stuff. I think we're both kind of research-aholics. I love it.
That's the most fun part.
Right.
How long did you work on this book, Kristen?
I started writing it in, let's see, it came out in 2010. I probably started writing in 2009 and started talking about it with the editor in 2007.
Let's take a look at another one of Kevin's illustrations from Crystal's book about Arthur Ashe.
And this one's a spread of his work in Africa, and actually we kind of wanted to keep it just a montage of images because it was more of a thing coming, like you say, it was the other half of Arthur Ashe.
I think this image is, again, so brilliant because I sent an email to Mr. Belford explaining to him that I think the word picture comes before book in picture book because so much of the story is image driven. Because you have 3,000 words to say whatever you want about something, but for someone like Arthur Ashe, this book would have been 5 times this size if I'd put in everything that I wanted people to know about him and to be as excited and as enthusiastic about as I was. But this image with the continent of Africa and the South African flag and just the light emanating from the center of the image, I think Mr. Belford's research shows, because in this image it just encompasses that the strength, I think the solitude and the serenity that Arthur Ashe showed in trying to end apartheid. He was the first major athlete to bring apartheid
What did he really do?
The common knowledge. He wanted to play in the South African Open, and they wouldn't let him because he was African American, even though he was one of the top players in the world. And you would think that anyone sponsoring any kind of tournament of an international sport would want the best people in the world, no matter what color they were. And instead of, you know, going to newspapers and picketing and raising a fist and spitting and hissing, he just very calmly kept asking them. And there's something about that drop of water on the mountain that will wear it down eventually.
You make a point in your book, it sort of relates to this, about lessons that Arthur Ashe's father taught him, that if you wanted to get into sports and break the racial barrier and stuff, that you had to kind of play the game and be courteous, sort of what you're saying, and sort of wear them down in a nice way.
Well, you have to be very tough, but you also have to be as smooth and pleasant as honey, too. It's that whole, you can catch more flies with sugar than you can with vinegar. And I'm all for vinegar. I'm totally vinegar. I mean, when I got into tennis and really got gung-ho, I mean, I wore tennis skirts everywhere. I was always squeezing that racquetball to develop this. This arm is still bigger than this one to this day, but I was a Jimmy Connors. I wouldn't hesitate to just, if I got frustrated, I'd throw my racket. I'm so embarrassed to be admitting this, really, but you know, admitting you have a problem is the first step to recovery. But I would always like calm down and think, I wish I could behave more like Arthur Ashe. I mean, it's just, you want that measure of control, because that is more intimidating to your opponent and more empowering to yourself than basically what my grandmother would call acting a fool.
Well, we need to take a break. When we come back, there's a really interesting story of how Arthur Ashe ended up in St. Louis. We're going to talk about that when we come back. We're talking about a new book about Arthur Ashe, and we'll continue right after this.
To the men and women of the United States Armed Forces, the USO is home. The USO depends on the generosity of the American people, people just like you. To find out how you can help, visit us at uso.org. The USO, until everyone comes home.
Did you vote in the last election? I know I would have. I'd want my voice to be heard. You see, the only way your ideas can count is for our elected officials to hear from you. My dad says it's easy. Just learn about the process and vote. So you have all this power to really make a difference. And you didn't take time to vote? Am I missing something?
Learn how to make your ideas count by logging on to www.representativedemocracy.org.
Experience St. Louis.
Game, Set, Match, Champion, Arthur Ashe. That's the title of a new book that tells the story of Arthur Ashe. It's written by our guest today, Crystal Hubbard, and illustrated by Kevin Belford, who are both with us today. And we're going to get back to the book in a moment. But a little background on you, Crystal, if I may. You grew up here in St. Louis.
Yes, sir.
Just right close to Tower Grove Park.
Yes.
Right? And for some time, I think you were a newspaper reporter. I know you worked in Boston. Could I have a little brief biography?
Well, I began my career as a writer, as a reporter at at a weekly multicultural paper called the Bay State Banner, which I absolutely loved because I was what's called a general features reporter, which meant everything: politics, entertainment, sports. If they needed a reporter for it, I was always the first one to volunteer. I'd write up to 10 stories a week. I got pregnant with my first child, and the travel and the schedule just became too much. Probably once I reached about 7 months pregnant, I was at a press conference that Hillary Clinton had in New Hampshire, and I was literally shoveling people aside with my stomach. And so I decided it was probably time to take a desk job. And it took a while to find a desk job. I believe my son was about 16 months old when the Boston Herald came calling and invited me for a tryout to be a sports copy editor there. And I love sports. Sports is, if you ever want to work in journalism and not have to actually deal with the emotional fallout of news, which is, I think, brutal. It's just, you're just dealing with so many different things that are not always positive. Sports is awesome. You just watch sports all night and edit stories about sports. And
you've done a couple other books, and we have the covers we want to share with our audience. And would you tell us a little bit about them when they come up on the screen? There are 2 books that you've done.
This was my first book. I actually started working on it in 1995 when I was home being a stay-at-home mom. When I was being a stay-at-home mom with my firstborn. It's the story of Marcinia Lyle, who at 10 years old got her first pair of baseball cleats from Gabby Street, who at the time was the manager of the World Series winning St. Louis Cardinals. And this was back in 1931. And this is a little African-American girl who wanted to grow up and play professional baseball. I think Marcinia is just the most amazing character because she's real. She was a real person. She played for the Kansas City Monarchs and the Indianapolis Clowns under the name Toni Stone, because she changed her name because she thought Marcinia was just too girly. When Hank Aaron left to play for the then Milwaukee Braves, I'm sorry, she took his spot at second base, and she was actually a really good player. Abe Saperstein, who created the Harlem Globetrotters, people had thought that he just put her on the Monarchs because, the Clowns, the Indianapolis Clowns, as a way to reel in lagging ticket sales because so many of their black stars were going to the major leagues at the time. But Marcinia could actually play.
And the second book?
This book, The Last Black King of the Kentucky Derby, is about a jockey named Jimmy Wingfield. He was the last African-American jockey to win the Kentucky Derby, and he's probably one of the most winningest, that's actually a word, in racing history. I was fascinated by him because being the last black athlete to win the Derby, there's something to being the first of anything to do something, but he was the last, because there was a time in America's sports history when African Americans were as prevalent in horse racing as they are in other sports now, like the NFL and the NBA and Major League Baseball. And so that struck my interest. Plus, he had the most incredible life. He was one of 17 children born to sharecroppers in Chillicothe, Tennessee. He ended up winning the Derby back-to-back in 1901 and 1902 and came this close to winning in 1903. He ended up moving to Europe, where he decided to race horses. He raced all over Europe for all the crown princes and aristocrats and royalty. He ended up marrying the daughter of a Russian aristocrat. At the height of his career, he probably made what today's equivalent would be to about $100,000.
That's interesting.
He ran from the Bolsheviks, the Nazis, and he never topped more than 115 pounds in his life.
And it's all in the book.
He's 5 feet tall. Exactly. Sorry. I get very excited about my
I
subjects.
can tell you, well, you have to have a passion to write about these things. And speaking of passion, I want to give Kevin a plug, too. Kevin was on this program, I guess it was about a year ago, Kevin, to talk about his book about the blues, and this is it? Devil at the Confluence. It's the story of the blues in St. Louis, and it's a fascinating book full of illustrations, even comes with a musical CD.
Yes. It's St. Louis music. It's a history of St. Louis music from the post-Civil War to the First World War.
And it's fascinating, the significant role that St. Louis played in the development of jazz. A lot of people think of Chicago and New Orleans, but St. Louis was really right up there.
Yeah.
People in the know. I got that book after I learned that you were my illustrator, and I loved it. It is fantastic.
It's a great book.
It,
And I looked up your
reads like a
books.
movie, kind of.
Well, I love we're both doing kind of eclectic subjects, the lesser-known heroes. I love that.
All right, well, back to Arthur Ashe.
Sorry.
He's a
Remember him?
Who?
Yeah. I want to get to the story of how he ended up in St. Louis. Let's take a quick look at another picture from the book, one that Kevin illustrated, from the book Game, Set, Match, Champion Arthur Ashe. What's this, Kevin?
This is one that illustrates the close relationship of Arthur and his father, which was very important. Another thing, a lot of these, I like this, your way of telling stories because they go inside of Arthur. And this one is powerful for that reason, just like the one from Africa.
Let me jump in. We referred to this in the first segment. Arthur Ashe grew up in Richmond, Virginia. It was very segregated. He wanted to play tennis, but they wouldn't let black people play, right? So you're talking about the close relationship with his dad. Wasn't it his dad that had an idea that Arthur was going to come to St. Louis and live with somebody so he could play tennis here? What's that story?
Well, Arthur ended up spending summers with Dr. Robert Johnson, who taught young African-American players in what he called his junior league at his home.
In St. Louis?
In Virginia, a different part of Virginia, about 3 hours away from Richmond. And Dr. Johnson soon realized that Arthur was just, his skill was outpacing his ability to coach him. And so since Richmond was segregated, the indoor courts that most players would play on in the winters were not accessible to African Americans. And so Dr. Johnson is the one who decided, well, I have a friend that I used to play tennis with at the University of Chicago. His name is Ronald Hudlin. He lives in St. Louis, lives near Washington University. We can send Arthur to live with him, and he can play all year round in St. Louis.
How long was he here?
He was here. He spent his entire senior year of high school. He went to Sumner and graduated with high honors. And probably not even a year after that, just the summer after, because then he ended up going to UCLA on a full tennis scholarship.
Did he ever talk about St. Louis later in life? Did he have good memories from here? Do you have any insight on that?
Absolutely. He thought St. Louis, in his book, one of his books, he wrote, I think, 9 altogether. He said that St. Louis was one of the best tennis towns in the United States.
You know, because we hear, when you live here, you know the history of St. Louis and the segregation and the racial tension that existed here at that time. So it's interesting that he came from somewhere where it was an improvement here.
Yes.
You know, and that's sort of fascinating.
Well, it's all a matter of perspective, I think.
Yeah.
No matter where you're from.
Yeah. Let's look at another image from the book, another one of Kevin's images. Kevin, you can tell us about it.
Okay.
Arthur Ashe.
This is, there were, so much images of play, and we wanted excitement. There is a lot of excitement in this book with the tennis games themselves. But this one, I think, we kept looking for ways to show what Crystal was saying about Arthur as a person. This is Ron Lazordi. No, I'm sorry, who's he playing?
I think this is either Odekirk or Laver.
It was one of his earliest.
Yes, one of his earliest Wimbledon matches, I think. And the thing about Arthur, but it kind of, I sort of saw this Caucasian player as an amalgam of all the players that Arthur, because he didn't play other African American opponents. He was, whether he won or lost, he treated his opponent the same way, with the utmost respect and total dignity and self-possession. Where
How was he treated, though, at the time? Was he treated with respect?
I would say on the court all the time, because he earned it, plain and simple. There were people who didn't want to play against him because he was African American. There were clubs that didn't want to have him on their courts because he was African American. But in college, there was I think it's the Bay club that was in California at the time. They were hosting a college tournament. UCLA was invited to play, but they sent a little codicil to their invitation. However, Mr. Ashe will not be permitted to join us, that sort of thing. Arthur was like, fine, I won't go then. The whole team wanted to boycott the tournament in support of Arthur, but he said, no, you guys go and play, although one of his other teammates, Charlie Passerell, who was Puerto Rican, decided to stay out in support of Arthur. But Arthur kind of got the last laugh in, so to speak, because after he became famous, the club extended an invitation to him to join, and he very politely declined.
Yeah, it's hard to understand. If I were he at the time, I mean, I don't think I'd taken it so well. I think I'd be mad.
But sometimes it just seems that your quietude has more of an impact on
Outclassing
people.
the other person is
Exactly.
kind of what it is about.
Especially when they know they did a total stupid thing.
Kind of stuff still happening today. We have a couple more images. Let's look at them back to back, Kevin, in the couple of minutes that we have remaining.
Arthur training as a young man with
Dr. Ronald Johnson. Yeah. I love this one because Dr. Johnson's neighbors would complain because Arthur would go out at 7:30 in the morning and just hit ball after ball after ball against his backboard. And I tried to duplicate the sound in the book in capped letters where it says thumpity bump. Because can you just imagine that noise echoing over and over and over in a quiet summer morning, and you know it's that kid. You can't go kill him because he's a kid. But just, and then, 20 years later to think that is the music.
That was Arthur Ashe.
That you were a part of.
Then they're bragging about it 20 years
I
later.
know.
I think we've got one more image if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's Arthur Ashe, Jimmy Connors. And
1975 Wimbledon final.
Yeah, the Wimbledon.
Which was awesome because I think everyone in this room was, well, not everyone, was old enough to remember this. And it was such a dynamic match where brains beat brawn and age conquered youth. It was just a battle for the ages.
It's a great book. Illustrations by Kevin Belford, written by Crystal Hubbard. It's Game, Set, Match, Champion, Arthur Ashe. And in just a few seconds, what happened to Arthur at the end of his life?
He contracted AIDS through 2 surgeries, through blood transfusions. In '92, USA Today said, we're going to out you. And he outed himself because he didn't want them to do it.
Well, thanks for adding to the history of Arthur Ashe and the legacy of Arthur Ashe with this book, both of you. It's really, really great, and I hope people will order a copy. Crystal,
So
Kevin, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks
I'm
for
Steve
having
Potter,
us.
and thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time on City Corner. Bye.